So, howdy. I'm trying to get y'all a better view. Stick around here. Yeah, I just had to use. Anyways, welcome to the fish room, everybody. Thanks for joining me at the Lost Begotten channel. And if you haven't had a chance to watch the entire Bill Maher interview, actually that whole Bill Maher show from last week, highly recommended. I had only seen the overtime part. I didn't get to see the previous part of his conversation with that whole Morel guy. But it was interesting. It wasn't the first reference to Jesus and the devil and whatnot. Hello. That's not where that belongs. And we're lucky enough to have Nancy Nancy. You usually see on this program from Moscow here in New York. We appreciate you being here, and that's a perfect segue. North Korea, this is a big win, no matter the political comment. It's hard to get Russia and China on the same page. Oh. It's hard to get them both on the same page, but it's not hard to get Russia and China on the same page. But on this page, and on this issue of North Korea, there's always been this unwritten agreement between Beijing and Moscow. They follow each other's line. The fact is that the Russians don't have a great deal of concern about what happens politically in North Korea. The Chinese do. They want to be seen at the top table of international diplomacy. You're a liar. You're either a complete fucking incompetent moron or a liar who should be investigated immediately. I'm really fucking tired of people hearing people say that Russia has nothing to do with North Korea. I've been trying that bullshit for long enough, and it's the only reason why no progress has been made. Apparently that's where that's going. Really. Whatever. From the accent, this is going to be a political relationship. It's going to be a point in the relationship between Washington and Moscow. The Trump administration will be able to turn around very difficult relations between these two countries. But of course, no matter what happens, the personality has been taken out of this. You're using 4 different British accents. This guy on CNN here, I'm trying to place where he's from, and he's just learned British accent from watching television when he was a kid. That's all. Fake British people. Beware of fake British people and people who sound like they're on some kind of cliche movie about women. Like Sebastian Gork. After engineered Google writes a manifesto making claims about women and their ability, you will not focus. And also coming up this hour, our special report. I hear Sebastian Gork's voice, and I'm like, shouldn't you be torturing Jesus or something? Never mind. former high school cheerleader addicted at 15 years old to the sheriff's wife, and his family torn apart when his wife becomes addicted to heroin.
Turn it upside down.
Did that to you?
Absolutely.
It broke your family apart.
Yes.
In the city of Chicago, finally lost on the job, but out of the office today. President Trump marks a milestone on a working vacation at the New Jersey Golf Club. This from a man who promised he would
Summary
not
of the Ken Starr era.
Instead, he is doing something he promised he would never stop
Oh,
doing. Just
maybe
firing
these
off on
Russians that
Twitter
we're now doing
and
business
taking
with will help us take down the Clintons.
with this one right here. The Trump base is far bigger and
Then
stronger
the
than
Russians,
ever before, despite the phony
by
fake news
Chinese
polling. Look at
proxy,
rallies in Pennsylvania, Iowa, Ohio, and West
started the
Virginia.
Whitewater.
The fact is, the fake news Russia collusion story, record stock
Whether it was
market,
actually
border
Chinese
security,
ownership of
military strength, jobs,
that
the
property
Supreme
or
Court
whatever
picked
that
economic
was all just fake
enthusiasm,
fucking
regulation, and so much more has
fabrication from
driven
Russia.
the Trump
You know,
base even closer together. Will
started
never change. So you have that.
that
As
bullshit
for that Russia investigation the president
and then
mentioned there,
ended up
the Justice Department
with fake DNA
launched
evidence
is
on
defending
a
that
dress.
investigation. They're going to have more on that in just a
It
second.
was real.
Let's begin right now with
Not a lot to
Caitlin
see.
Collins, who is with the working vacationing president in New Jersey today.
But in 2002,
For the first day of
Russia
vacation. Yeah,
decided to brag about
right.
its
Hey,
ability
clearly the bad weather is driving the
fabricate
president
DNA.
tweet this morning. Though the White House has been insistent that this is a working vacation that's only
Just 4 years
necessary
later.
for repairs that are happening right now.
I'm sure they got right on revealing that technology as soon as they
On
got
the
it.
president's
Could not
schedule for
wait.
today. We were told by a White House spokesman shortly ago that the president did receive his intelligence briefing this morning, and he also had an hour-long phone call with Secretary of State Rex Tillerson and his new chief of staff, John Kelly, to discuss
The Trump
North
intelligence
Korea. We
briefs
also know that he has been on
are a
Twitter
pair of
and
underwear
on
with a fucking
television
iPhone.
this morning. In a series of about 9 tweets this morning, the president talked about his accomplishments these first 200 days in office, including his Supreme Court nominee, border security, and the stock market.
Look,
numbers.
Mr. Trump,
He also
we've
went after
combined
the
your toilet with your Twitter rap.
poll numbers,
It's now
which,
called
he
Shitter.
doesn't think accurately reflects everything he's accomplished these 200 days in office. He's sitting at about a 38% job approval rating in the Gallup poll. And he also is watching television. We know this because he went after Senator Richard Blumenthal about 2 minutes after his interview on CNN this morning. Blumenthal voiced support for continuing the investigation into Russian meddling in the election. And then Trump got on Twitter shortly after and called him a con artist and questioned his past military service. Now, we also know, Kate, that the president is going to New York this next week because he tweeted about it. He said, working hard from New Jersey while White House goes through long-planned renovation. Going to New York next week for more meetings. That was the first we had heard about these meetings in New York, but we'll likely find out more about them soon. But that's what's happening here in New Jersey.
If it was a long-planned renovation, you wouldn't bother pointing it out. Because you said it's a long-planned renovation, it means it's a spur-of-the-moment renovation.
Okay. Stay close to
The opposite of everything he ever fucking says is exactly how you find what the real story is going on.
the Twitter feed for your scheduling updates today, Caitlin. Great to see you. Thank you so much. Speaking
If he ever started telling the truth, we'd all be really fucking thrown off.
of Twitter, the president fired off another tweet this morning, like this one. Hard to believe, he said, that with 24/7 fake news on CNN, ABC, NBC, CBS, New York Times, and Washington Post, that the Trump base is getting stronger. Let's discuss that. For more on that, CNN political director David Callahan is joining me now. The tweets are so long these days that I feel like it's taking me a long time to get through. All right, so David, let's talk about that. The president says the base is stronger than ever. What does the polling say about Trump's base right now?
Yeah, he said it's growing and getting bigger and stronger. There's not a shred of evidence I can find to suggest that's true. So he points to in his tweets, he pointed to Pennsylvania rallies, Iowa rallies, Ohio rallies, West Virginia rallies. I mean, those rallies are as big as he, has had rallies in the past. I don't see what the evidence is there that represents a stronger, growing, getting bigger base of support. In fact, the polling would indicate that there is some erosion, a little bit of cracks in his base of support.
And some of the numbers that we've been discussing, we get back to the Q poll, and we're looking at some of what you're talking about. The Quinnipiac University poll that shows that when it comes to white voters without a college degree, there has been, it shows a support there. I think in June it said it was 53% support. You see right there. But also there is a Gallup daily tracker, David, that shows a less maybe big jump in a decline of support amongst his base, but still a decline, a trend towards the negative.
Yeah, I think the Quinnipiac poll is a bit of an outlier and a bigger margin of error there. Gallup interviews a lot more people, and this does show, as you're saying, the trajectory is going in the wrong direction. It's going down. That's not what you want. So that's the sliver. We also saw in that Quinnipiac poll that among Republicans, even 76% approval. That, I mean, obviously that's a good number in a vacuum, but among Republicans, you would expect a Republican president to be well in the northern part of the 80s and in the 90s. 76% approval in your own party shows that there's been some diminishing of support from your own partisans.
So you've got that. And you also have some, maybe acknowledge.
He's doing worse than Bush during the fucking economic collapse.
For all of our viewers, remember, she's a pollster at heart. She knows these numbers and the mechanics. And she said on the Sunday show that they have some work to do. Listen to this.
I would note, too, in some of the polling, which, of course, I scour daily on behalf of the president, his approval rating among Republicans and conservative and Trump voters is down slightly. It needs to go up. They are telling him, just enact your program. Don't worry about a Congress that isn't supporting legislation to get big-ticket items done. And don't worry about all the distractions and diversions and discouragement that others who are still trying to throw logs in your path are throwing your way.
I was surprised to hear Kellyanne Conway acknowledge that it's coming from the White House, that his numbers are down. That almost feels like the first time we've heard that from the White House. What does that say?
Yeah, my ears perked up a bit with that also. I mean, as you know, Kellyanne is a pollster by trade and does indeed live and read these numbers, and so it's hard not to see what they're actually saying, even for someone that's on the Trump team like Kellyanne. But you heard what she did there, right? She acknowledged that his number among Republicans and conservatives is a bit down and they need to go up, but it's not his fault. It's Congress. It's those that are trying to throw logs in his way. It is those voters just saying, ignore all that, keep marching forward, and that's the way to heal the numbers. I don't know that really seems the advice that she's giving the president, but it seems to avoid any responsibility that his downtick in numbers, even among his own partisans and his base, might be something new to him.
Yeah, let's see if keeping on the path helps him forward in the next 200 days, as they say in these 200 days. Great to see you, David. Thank you so much.
Thanks, King.
All right, so President Trump, just 200 days in, as I mentioned, to his term, and he is already hearing footsteps. It's not a stampede of Republicans at his heels at the moment. The New York Times has been new reporting that several Republicans are running their own shadow campaigns for 2020 amid some doubts that the president will seek a second term. The president's own second-in-command tops the list of those the folks are keeping their eye on right now, according to the Times. But even that suggestion brought on an almost unprecedented level of pushback from the White House, from the vice president himself, issuing a formal statement calling the newspaper's claims absurd, disgraceful, and offensive. CNN special correspondent Jamie Gangel has been working her sources on this, but she's here with me right now. It is unusual how forceful that statement was, and not just how forceful it was, but it was an official statement coming from the vice president on this one. What's behind it?
Right, because, look, sometimes you see someone come on the Sunday talk show, or the staff will come and push back. To get it on formal letterhead like that, very unusual. Now, I just was speaking to a senior Republican source who just told me that, in fact, the president, they believe, knew about it ahead of time, that the article was coming out, and was not upset about the article. So why did the vice president push back so strong? No vice president wants to appear to be measuring the curtains in the Oval Office ahead of time. And in talking to people who know the vice president very well, he is particularly sensitive about this. We're also told that they had a heads up the story was coming, and they said to the New York Times, look, if you go with this, we think it's out of context, we're going to push back hard. They pushed back hard, and at the same time, what did the vice president do? He got to send a message across the way to the president, I'm not, no pitter-patter of footsteps from me.
One thing that a lot of folks wonder, and you read that statement, you wonder if that statement was written not for the country, not more than your time before an audience.
An audience of one. An audience of one. Well, no question. Does Donald Trump like it when people upstage him?
Okay.
Is he going to like
So.
Anthony Scaramucci, Steve Bannon. Remember the cover of the magazine, President Bannon? How about Jeff Sessions, right?
Apparently, the instant baby brine shrimp, I just put some of them in here. They are not what I thought they were. I thought it was decapsulated cysts in some sort of anaerobic solution, but these are actually hatched Artemia that basically they come in this little guy here. And well, it's good for feeding these guys, but definitely not something you can give fry, because they're not alive, they're dead. It does look like, and I just examined it under my giant magnifying glass, it does look like they were all sedated or whatever they do to them right at the point where they're supposed to be fed. So they're all very small limbed and they're all very thick yolked, which means they're going to have max nutrition and minimal negative effect on the intestinal tract of baby fish. Anyway. For 1 o'clock, Friday. Have y'all had any luck seeing little babies?
You feel like little tiny white dots moving around from time to time. Can't see the screen out there. Yeah, now you can see one of them. Yeah, there you go.
It is, this president is not afraid to call out his administration publicly. His vice president does want to be in that group.
He's not afraid to take orders from Russia, call out the quote establishment like a good little communist hipster from the fucking 70s.
I mean, absolutely. I think that Republicans should be cognizant that 2018 could not go their way. And you look at how President Trump's strategy increasingly seems to be that he wants to pick fights with the GOP Congress and he wants to push the blame for not getting anything done on the GOP Congress. And right now, that's a pretty decent strategy for him because he has higher approval rating than Congress. But in the long term, it's certainly not going to help Republicans get elected. But Governor, talk about the dynamics here. The dynamics of a party that is afraid to back its president and a president who doesn't fall in line with the party. How does that play out?
Well, I think it plays out poorly for the president. If you're a Republican, what really, to me, was the red line if I was a Republican congressman or a senator.
This next one says Donald Trump losing support among white voters by MSNBC. AM Joy. I've been thinking about, should I just start calling local KKK branches or whatever they call them, whatever the kids are calling it these days, and just be like, he's a Mongol and basically a Georgian sultan, right? He's not white, He's plotting the destruction of the white race while using you for support. He's an embarrassment to white people. At best.
We are cracking down strongly
Yeah.
that shield criminal alien. We are building a wall on the southern border.
We're going to make sure none of our crops get harvested so that Americans start starving like my grandfather did in Russia.
Also prevents new immigrants from going on welfare for at least 5 years, so you don't come in and go on welfare. Our plan favors
That should really help the immigrant crime rate.
applicants who can speak English, who can support themselves financially.
I come here to this country. They say I be free. They say they take care of me. I come here, they don't give me shit. Doesn't that sound like somebody getting arrested for stealing from Walmart?
Clearly, Donald Trump knows which lines will get the biggest applause in places like West Virginia, one of the few places where he remains very, very popular.
I fucked my daughter.
Much of his campaign
I bet you that one plays over well in West Virginia. My daughter, Ivanka's so hot.
speech there on a new proposal, a Republican plan to slash legal immigration by half. It's a bill that would need 60 votes to pass the Senate, and thus is almost complete.
Sean, you're not implying that West Virginia is full of inbred rednecks. Yeah.
Fail. But with no power on Capitol Hill, a party that no longer fears him, policies hamstrung by his own agencies or by the courts, and polling that can best be described as dismal, it is, I think, fair
I didn't need to imply that Donald Trump fucks his daughter, do I? I thought that was a given.
to start to think of Donald Trump's presidency at this point as mostly performative. In other words, red meat theater is all he has left. And joining me now, TheRoot.com, Jason Johnson, Republican strategist Noel Nickfor, President and CEO of Voto Latino, Maria Teresa Kumar, and Republican strategist Chris Metzler. Thank you guys for being here. So, the sort of Maria Teresa, the sort of performance aspect of what Donald Trump is doing right now has kind of gone back to where it was in the campaign. It's very much directed at immigrants. The implication being immigrants of color coming in and getting on welfare. What do you make of him returning to that well?
Smart lady
All
here.
the years that he announced that he announced his presidency, and he's back where he started in large part because he realizes that he keeps losing in the White House. The fact that he has so much theatrics and chaos and upheaval within his own break and file within the White House, he realizes, wait, I need to give something. We can't underestimate how painfully difficult it was for him to lose healthcare reform. Yeah, it was really difficult, and the fact that he now is going back and saying, hey, look over here because I don't actually have a legislative agenda. Yeah, it's basically what he's doing.
And Noel, it's interesting because this is happening at a time when Donald Trump is finally starting to bleed white voters. There was a pretty extraordinary set of numbers that came out from Quinnipiac this week that showed that in February he was up +4 with white voters overall. He's now down -17. He dropped 17 points. He had dropped 1 point with white men, which is his strongest base of support. And even among white voters with no college degree, he's -7. He's gone down. So he's starting to erode the base. Well, is that why you're starting to see him go back so well? And is that sort of a cynical take on his part on what will motivate white voters?
Well, think about this. If you're, the numbers that you put up, if he's starting to lose support amongst his base, what do you naturally do? You do what attracted them, and you go back pretty much on the campaign trail, even though you are president. You go back and you rally that base. Did you look at the background of the people when you did that? They were like, oh, rah! That actually exhilarates Donald Trump, and it feels like that rallies that base, and it keeps them on tilt. Now, the other thing that I thought was kind of funny is the fact that the Republican Party as a whole has had a problem attracting minorities and like Hispanics or whatever to the party. With this immigration bill, I think this is going to drive a wedge. So I'm not sure if they have thought about the true implications and how this is going to affect not only some of the people that crossed over and added to that base, but newcomers that are going to be like, wait a minute, this might not be fair to me.
Okay, and very funny because we're talking about this agreement, right? To bring our conversation down. But people who are in business, small businesses, aren't going to be thrilled about this bill, even if they are Republicans.
Yeah, okay, this is what we were talking about, and this is true. It's that in this bill, the immigration immigration bill, did you guys know that they snuck in a wording that kills the EB-5 financing? It does a lot of tricky things. That's a kind of yeah. And what's so funny is the EB-5 financing is something that the Trump family, the Kushner family have really enjoyed. Not only just them, but like I've got people that I know that are in it. I've got a lot of donors that are in it. It's a program. If it's worked right, it is great. And it gives, I think it's $18 billion worth of foreign investment that comes into this country. And not only that, but it helps the GDP. The more foreign workers that we have, the more that the GDP, the growth, productivity depends on that. Now, all of it goes hand in hand on the economy.
Good thing I had a lid on that. Almost just went in there. Bounced right there. He thinks they're all frogs with red caps.
Don't understand the concept of reverse discrimination. It either is discrimination or it's not. When we talk about reverse discrimination, what we're saying is there is regular discrimination, and when it comes to discriminating against white men, this is a special and kind of sinister form of discrimination. So as a purely legal term, that makes absolutely no sense. That's number one. Number two, as it relates to the whole question of affirmative action. So here's the issue. Based on what the proposal is for this new immigration status, that is in fact affirmative action. You are giving preference to people based on being able to speak English. So here we are having legislation talking over out of many sides of its mouth. It makes no sense.
And at the same time, Jason, you do have to Noel's point, Donald Trump, when he needs to be emotional, when he needs to be rejuvenated himself, he does go back to it. I have to play this, which is going to look like it's from the campaign, but it's actually from this week in West Virginia. This is Donald Trump in West Virginia and his crowd. Take a listen.
What the prosecutors should be looking at are Hillary Clinton's 33,000 deleted emails.
Now, is that going to be enough to keep the base group? And they're not going to lock up Hillary Clinton.
He cannot get over his act. Like, he's just here's the problem. All of these different policies he's rolled out this week apply to this. So he's lost the Republican Party and gained the grand jury, right? He's lost white voters, and now he's going to gain fights with universities, primarily predominantly white institutions. That's what he's going to be fighting if Jeff Sessions goes along with this plan. None of this is productive. And this is, I think, the key thing, Joy. Great job numbers on Friday. Excellent job numbers, and yet his poll numbers are still dropping. Why? Because he's failing to provide the enthusiasm and the positivity that he claimed that he was going to bring when he got to the White House. So this is, I'm not going to say it's a failed presidency yet, but you can keep throwing things at the wall, and it's not going to work. And that's what he's realizing right now, that these sort of race-based, white nationalist, Steve Bannon policies that he's promoting are not enough to even get white voters to support it.
I mean, they're good for a rally, but I mean, even he seems to know that they're not real. I mean, one of the most extraordinary things about his the leaked transcripts of his conversations with the president of Mexico and with the Australian PM is that he admitted in this January 27th call, he says, I'm willing to say on the wall with Enrique Peña Nieto, I'm willing to say that we'll work it out, meaning who's going to pay for the wall. But that means it will come out in the wash, and that's okay. But you cannot say anymore that the United States is going to pay for the wall. I'm just going to say we're going to work it out. He essentially was like, it's the least important thing we're doing, but I need you to lie for me.
Yes, throw me a bone. Just help me. But this is the thing. Everything that Donald Trump is doing with the help of Jeff Sessions is basically trying to disenfranchise people of color communities quickly, to dismantle the system that we've been playing.
Or at least say he's going to, because they are moving to it.
But this idea that all of a sudden we don't want affirmative action, for example, we are actually not preparing the leadership
revenue in the next 25 years. We have a majority-minority group of Americans coming in less than 25 years, but we're not ready. This immigration policy is completely anti-American. It's elitist. It actually is basically saying we're not asking any. The American people, we're no longer asking for the best, the brightest, the people that come here with $5 and all of a sudden create empires. We want the rich people.
Well,
Yeah, that's how we should
I want to ask that from an academic perspective, as a college professor. This is hurting the country financially.
Yeah.
Students with money from abroad are like, I don't want to come here anymore. They're going to school in China. They're going to school in Europe. They're going to school other places because this administration is saying you and now your money are no longer welcome. And you're exactly right. 40% of the American population under 15 are brown.
Yeah.
These kids are going to college no matter what kind of policy.
Chris, you're trying to be the limited person.
Yeah, so here's the problem. The problem is this. There is no cohesive strategy. That is what I'm waiting for. What is the strategy? Instead, what we have is a mishmash of things that are just, it's like shooting in the dark. It's like shooting fish in a barrel. That's what we have. As a strategist, I would have to say there is no strategy. There is a lot of talk. There is a lot of random policies, but there is no strategy. The result is going to be a collapsed economy. The result is going to be further division. So let's not pretend that because what we now have is a general as chief of staff, that solves all of the problems.
Yeah.
The White House is one thing, America is another.
One of the things that I think is going to be very interesting with this immigration policy coming
Headed
forward
toward an economic
is the fact
collapse.
that, what
Yes,
it's gonna
we
do
are.
In the midterm
Yes, we
elections,
are.
when you have a lot of legislators that are backed by, heavily populated immigrant districts, what are we going to see there? Are they going to support this? Are they going to, break and go rogue and say, I'm not going to?
Eight Republicans up in California alone. 8 Republican seats in California. You've got seats in Florida.
Yeah.
So it's not as if all of these districts are
There are
white.
56 districts that have at least 7% Latino population concentrated in 7 states.
Yeah.
So it's not like they're not paying attention. If anything, all this red meat that they're throwing, people are feeling under duress in these communities, and the only way they're going to be able to fight back is participating in polls. And that is why I actually do think that this is part of a larger strategy of disenfranchisement. That is why people are going. This is why Jeff Sessions is trying to ensure voter purges, wanting to make sure that we have access to forfeitures. At the end of the day, all of a sudden pull back and say, yes, you are now going to be going to prison for a minor weed violation. This is part of a larger strategy. Until the American people come forth and say this is not on our watch, it is going to be dismal.
Last word to Chris Metzler.
That's what he tells all the
And
girls.
I think that's the issue here. I mean, we're going down a rabbit hole here rather than moving America forward. So we can, take credit for jobs and we can do all of that. But at some point, what's going to happen is that the base is going to realize that these policies, so-called policies, these rallies, all of those kinds of things is not making their lives better. And that's where we lose as Republicans. Until we realize that and start taking action towards that, we are sadly mistaken as to what the effect is going to be.
Chris Metzler, thank you very much. Really appreciate having you here. Jason, Noel, and Maria Tracy will be back. And reminding you again, Chris and Noel are Republicans. This was not offensive. Two of these guys are Republicans trying to talk to you through the TV, Donald Trump. Up next, Donald Trump, congratulates himself on President Obama's economy. Stay with us.
Hey there, I'm Chris Hayes from MSNBC. Thanks for watching MSNBC on YouTube. If you want to keep up to date with the videos we're putting out, you can click subscribe just below me, or click over on this list to see lots of other
See,
great
Bubbles
videos.
not babies like that.
I'm trying to put this stupid thing back on here.
Okay. So we had a power out earlier. That was fun. Yes, the little black dots are the babies. Right, you can definitely see one of them right there on the top, right from the green area.
Oh, shit. So, now that I finally have some spawning happening, I'm finally having some problems with my cultures. Man, I just pulled a sample to inspect it. Oh, good God, what the hell? I just found air current was off. That'll crash a culture real quick. And my one culture I'm expecting to do well is down here getting churned up. More samples. I wonder how people grow rotifers. Air stuff turning up the water. I really don't want that much stuff. Water movement too high. That's generally what happens to crash one of my cultures is too much air.
We are cracking
Oh,
down
now we have
on
hands. No, I
sanctuary
already touched
cities
that.
that shield criminal aliens. We are building a wall on the southern
in the
border.
background.
Our proposal prevents new immigrants from going on welfare for at
Playing in
least
the
5
background.
years, so you don't come in and go on welfare.
Now watch.
Our plan
I want y'all to see this. Here we
favors
go.
applicants
Proof that
who
YouTube
can
is hacked
speak
by
English,
Russia.
who can support themselves financially.
Oh, it didn't do it that time? Usually it'll keep playing when I exit, which is really creepy. But planning on going into that. Just like going to the beach. Choking on seawater. Although I must admit, my tank tastes better than the Gulf of Mexico. It probably tastes about like one of my rotifers cultures that have crashed. I'm sitting down. I'm not crouched nearby for a change. You probably usually hear me shuffling around while I'm working. What's the TV back? I'm trying to put the TV back on right now. At which point I will probably forget I'm supposed to be taking a break and find something else.
Does the president have a clear-eyed understanding of the nature of his counterpart in Russia and the nature of the regime? The nature of the Russian regime, yeah. Well, I mean, I think everybody's pretty clear on that, right? The nature of the Russian regime is one person, isn't it? I mean, so I think you have an autocratic regime and an individual who's done an extraordinarily effective job at consolidating power. And we're talking obviously about the annexation of Crimea, the invasion of Ukraine here, the attack on our election, but also the attack on our election, the attack, the very sophisticated campaign of subversion and disinformation and propaganda that is ongoing every day. So it's part of you
Targeting him now.
Interview here on MSNBC with National Security Advisor H.R. McMaster. He's the latest Trump official whose future is reportedly in question. At least that's what Steve Bannon and a lot of Russian bots on Twitter would want you to think. With us now, we got.
I heard, I think it was Chris Cuomo earlier, maybe it was Jake Tapper, talking about MS-13, and he said unexpectedly instead of unexpectedly. Now that's funny.
Senior reporter for Business Insider, Natasha Bertrand, who covers national security and foreign policy, holds as a professor of political science and the director of the Institute for International Studies at Stanford University, former ambassador to Russia, Michael McFaul. Mr. Ambassador, let's begin with you. It certainly sounds like General McMaster has the traditional American line against Vladimir Putin and the Russians. What do you think?
Listen up. This is a guy who knows things.
I thought that snippet from HR was the most concise and accurate statement of Vladimir Putin and his foreign policy intentions. It was fantastic. Analytically, it's exactly right from my point of view. What I don't know, of course, is whether the president shares his national security advisor's assessment of Russian intentions. You've got to believe, Natasha, you've got H.R. McMaster saying that. You've got the Vice President of the United States saying that. You've got a lot of other officials, Nikki Haley at the UN saying that. It certainly sounds like that's the official position
of the Trump administration. Even the president wants to say it, and yet you reported that the long knives are out for General McMaster. Tell us about it.
Well, I mean, judging from that snippet that we just saw from his interview with Hugh Hewitt, it's really no wonder that the, Russian bots and trolls are kind of out to get him. It's the same with the nationalist wing in the White House. I mean, you have the Bannon wing, who is really, not happy with McMaster, especially after the firings of Derek Harvey and Rich Higgins. So this is just like, it's an ideological battle that we're seeing play out in the White House, and it's really unclear. I mean, I think that the nationalist wing has kind of the competitive advantage at the moment, just because Trump has said in the past that, he kind of finds H.R. McMaster's, strategy annoying in terms of how he does the briefing. He doesn't really like how he talks to him. Sometimes he feels like it's a bit condescending. We'll see.
So they're nationalists, but they're Jewish, but they work for Russia, but they're not really Jewish. But one of them's Jewish. Yeah.
How John Kelly deals with all of this. His presence in the White House definitely gives McMaster more of a chance at surviving, but we'll see.
And obviously this weekend, Mr. Ambassador, Donald Trump came out and reiterated his support for General McMaster. I talked about how valuable he was to the foreign policy team, and most importantly, this past week, the president allowed General McMaster to do something, or actually allowed John Kelly to do something that he had not allowed General McMaster to do before, and that is get rid of a couple of people in the National Security Council who were unhelpful to the cause.
Yeah, and I just have to applaud that. I mean, I worked at the National Security Council for 3 years. You cannot have people on that staff. It's a small staff. The senior staff is small. That don't support the views of the National Security Advisor. And I would just say it would be a shock and a real crisis if the president now turned on H.R. McMaster and fired him because of some quote-unquote nationalists who think that they know foreign policy better. This is a strong team right now with the right views, I think, on a lot of foreign policy issues at a really dangerous time in American foreign policy. We need the best and the brightest running the show right now.
Mr. Ambassador, you, of course, have been very critical of Donald Trump on foreign policy for a very long time. But I did notice this weekend you rightly saluted him for a 15-0 vote against North Korea on sanctions. That was quite an accomplishment. Congratulations, real Donald Trump. This vote is a genuine foreign policy achievement, which it certainly was. But you just also said something I think pretty significant with H.R. McMaster where he is, with John Kelly where he is, with General Mattis where he is. This president, for all of the problems that you and I agree on, but this president right now has a pretty damn strong foreign policy team assembled, does he not?
Yes, I agree. Let's be clear, UN Security Council resolutions don't solve military problems, but they're a good step in the right direction. It's hard to get the Russians and Chinese to sign up to Security Council resolutions on anything, let alone North Korea, so it's an achievement. And Ambassador Haley should get credit too, as you were talking before the break. I think she's done a very commendable job as the UN ambassador. I still worry about the commander-in-chief. I want to be clear about that. I still worry that he's not in alignment with his team. But to mess with this team right now, I think would send a very bad signal to our allies, both in Europe and Asia. He needs to keep this team in place.
Nicole, if you look at what I can expand this out. You look at what John Kelly said. You look at what General McMaster said about the Russians. You look at what Nikki Haley said about the Russians. You look at what Vice President Pence said about the Russians on the Russians' doorstep. If Donald Trump didn't want them saying that, they wouldn't be saying that. And so it's interesting, everybody in the administration saying that. Donald Trump is staying quiet, though, obviously, and that's maddening to a lot of us about Vladimir Putin and a lot of steps he's taken. But that said, at some point, we've got to go back to Halpern's favorite quote of Bill Clinton: if the turtle is on top of a fence post,
he signed the Russian sanctions with 2 statements, not one,
You're giving him entirely too much credit.
which is the norm, and reiterated his rage with Congress. And it was John McCain that continues to sort of keep him honest and frankly rebuke him. It was John McCain over the weekend who pointed out that all the talk about 2020 is because he's so weak. And I think, Natasha, you're reporting about McMaster is so interesting because Steve Bannon doesn't seem like merely a rogue agent inside the West Wing. And I'm guessing that if he didn't feel that he had some cover, either spoken or perceived, from the President of the United States, he wouldn't be knifing McMaster. Well, he has a full weight of Breitbart behind him, right? I mean, he has, he is very, or he claims to be very in touch with Trump's base. So I think that's why he feels like he's so safe in the White House, because he is in touch with this kind of nationalist base that Trump has for support. That, if anything, it might be eroding a tiny bit, but if anything, it's remained fairly strong. I mean, that's the 33-34% that we've seen remain steady. But I would also just note that it's not necessarily, a loyalty thing with regards to McMaster, because McMaster has gone to bat for Trump in the past. I mean, he, when Trump had that Oval Office meeting with the Republicans, staked his credibility on the line when Trump told the Russians about Israeli intelligence, and then he went to bat for Kushner, Jared Kushner, also when it was reported that Kushner had this meeting with the Russian ambassador and offered to set up a back channel. McMaster said, well, I don't see anything necessarily wrong with that. So this isn't necessarily something that has to do with loyalty. I think that makes it clear that this is purely ideological.
And I'm not so sure also that Steve Bannon's not striking out, because Steve Bannon's position's been dramatically weakened over the past month.
What's really going on with Kelly and McMaster? Pretty obvious. But I'm not telling.
Like 6 days. Ambassador McFall, I'm very concerned for your well-being on Twitter. You've said 2 positive things about Donald Trump this morning, so I'm going to throw you a softball on a subject that you can be deeply critical of the president and still walk out of the studio in one piece. You were talking about Trump TV, something we discussed at the top of the show, at the top of this hour. And you said, wow, it feels eerily like so many state-owned channels I've watched in other countries. Tell us about that concern.
Well, Joe, probably more than most Americans, I've watched a lot of state-run TV. I went to the Soviet Union for the first time in 1983. It's my job to follow that country and many other communist countries. And it just was a very weird, eerie thing to praise the president. The president does no wrong. The president is in charge of all good events that happen in the country. Very strange kind of way. And it just makes me wonder who actually looks at that and listens to that and thinks, oh, I agree with that. And I find it somewhat disturbing that we now have a president with his own television station. I thought that was what the White House communications was for. But these are new times, so we use new technologies.
These are new times, Natasha. What's the reaction that you've heard from Trump TV?
Who's paying for it? I mean, who's compensating Kayleigh McEnany for going on this show and kind of just, spouting this pro-Trump? I mean, I would argue propaganda. I mean, it's really kind of disturbing. That's what I've been hearing from a lot of people who don't really know where it came from, who don't really know, where it's being filmed, how it's being, organized. It's just kind of, it came out of left field. So.
All right. Well, and that's a question actually that Nika asked, was asking who's paying for this. I'm not sure who's paying for it. I think most likely the campaign, but that's something for us all to check and see. Ambassador Michael McFall, thank you so much for being with us. And thank you to Pastor Bertrand as well. Greatly appreciate it. I hope you're all right, Mr. Ambassador. Be safe out there. Okay. After a couple of positive comments. Now,
Probably slash the VOA budget to pay for it. China Uncensored has a new video out called "Should We Be Afraid of China's Military?" I recommend y'all go check that out. I haven't seen it yet. I'm not going to play it here because it's not news. It's YouTuber. But look, there's my broadcast. I can broadcast my broadcast of my broadcast without doing so.
Around the world, thanks very much for joining us. President Trump marks his 200th day in office today, taking direct aim at the news media and touting his base, but he's also facing major challenges here in the United States and indeed abroad. The president is at his golf club in New Jersey on what the White House is calling a working vacation. He tweeted today that his base is bigger and
Not the president.
stronger than ever, despite the news media. Meanwhile, in Manila, Secretary of State Rex Tillerson and the Russian Foreign Minister Sergei Lavrov faced off over new sanctions on Russia and the state of relations between the United States and Russia.
Wolf. The word Lavrov just kind of rolled off your tongue there, didn't it? I want to hear that again.
Secretary of State Rex Tillerson and the Russian Foreign Minister Sergei Lavrov faced off over new sanctions on
Sergei Lavrov.
Russia and the state of relations between the United States and Russia. Back here in Washington.
Speak American. It's Sergei Lavrov.
And the Deputy Attorney General weighed in on the scope of the Russia investigation. Rod Rosenstein says independent counsel Robert Mueller can pursue any evidence of a
Or Sergei Lavrov.
crime that he uncovers. And North Korea today threatened revenge against the United States over new sanctions. The United Nations Security Council unanimously approved the sanctions in response to Pyongyang's ballistic missile tests. North Korea today calling the sanctions an attack and warning the United States, and I'm quoting the North Korean state media right now, against believing that its land is safe across the ocean. The sanctions against Pyongyang dominated a number of discussions at the Asia Regional Security Forum that's ongoing in the Philippines. Both the Russian and South Korean foreign ministers spoke with their North Korean counterpart, the North Korean foreign minister, at the meeting. For more, let's go to our senior international correspondent, Ivan Watson. He's on the scene for us, joining us live from Manila. Ivan, North Korea clearly not backing down in its public statements. So what happens next with these latest sanctions?
Well, the new sanctions, what they do is they ban the North Korean export of coal, of iron, and even of seafood. And in theory, U.S. diplomats say that that should cut up to a third of North Korea's export revenues. But U.S. Secretary of State Rex Tillerson, he conceded that it'll be now very important to see how that goes through in practice. Will this ban actually be implemented? Take a listen.
So the next steps, obviously, are to see that the Security Council resolution sanctions are enforced by everyone, and we hope again that that this ultimately will result in North Korea coming to the conclusion to choose a different pathway, and when the conditions are right, that we can sit and have a dialogue around the future of North Korea.
And when it
comes to the conditions being right, another thing that Tillerson pointed out was, well, they've got to get some kind of signal from Pyongyang that it's ready to sit down. For instance, suspending the intercontinental ballistic missile launches. There were 2 of them just last month. He said that would be a positive sign, a signal that North Korea would be willing to sit down. But from all the rhetoric we've seen from numerous different statements from Pyongyang today, Wolf, it does not look like the North Koreans are in the mood to talk. Wolf?
All right, Ivan, thanks very much. Ivan Watson reporting for us from Manila. The White House says President Trump held an hour-long phone call this morning with the Secretary of State, Rex Tillerson, and the new White House Chief of Staff, retired General John Kelly. They discussed the situation involving North Korea. Let's get some more perspective now. I'm joined by Malvina Wong. She's a former senior advisor to U.S. Ambassador Christopher Hill. If you remember, Ambassador Hill was head of the U.S. delegation to the 6-party talks aimed at resolving the North Korean nuclear crisis. Also joining us, our CNN military and diplomatic analyst, retired Rear Admiral John Kirby. He's a former State Department and Pentagon spokesperson. Thanks to both of you for joining us. Malvina, the North Korean regime, the foreign minister, actually, who was invited to attend this meeting with all these other Asian countries, including the United States. He actually met with the Russian and the South Korean foreign ministers, which is significant. He issued a statement saying this, the North Korean foreign minister: "We will under no circumstances put the nukes and ballistic rockets on negotiating table. Neither shall we flinch even an inch from the road to bolstering up the nuclear forces chosen by ourselves unless the hostile policy and nuclear threat of the United States against the DPRK, the Democratic People's Republic of Korea, are fundamentally eliminated." Is that just rhetoric, or is there some significance here?
Well, I think it's both. On the one hand, we have to dismiss some of the most fiery parts of the rhetoric, because this is constant, and North Korea likes to entertain the world, actually, with some flamboyant language. On the other hand, I think North Korea is setting the stage, and it's saying exactly what it is willing or not willing to do. And I think, in a way, it maximalizes its position, and that's part of its negotiating strategy.
How significant is it, John, that the North Korean foreign minister was A, invited, and B, actually participated and had direct face-to-face meetings with the South Korean foreign minister, the Russian foreign minister, among others?
Not insignificant. I mean, ASEAN they're not a normal member of ASEAN, so that they were there, I think, was unique. And I think in a way, it's not all bad, right? That he had a chance to interact and to have dialogue with other members of the community.
What do you think of it?
Well, ARF, the ASEAN Regional Forum, is an annual event. So I don't think it's necessarily that significant that North Korea was there. On the other hand, North Korea could have chosen not to come. So I think that it showed up, and it's willing to sort of set its position, which is much further out in the field than the rest of the international community, is significant.
What is also significant is that the United Nations Security Council over the weekend unanimously, 15-0, passed a resolution imposing new sanctions against North Korea. Russia on board, China on board. Clearly, the U.S. ambassador, Nikki Haley, was thrilled.
Yeah, well, apparently this was an initiative that they put forward. I think it is significant. These are comprehensive sanctions, and the administration deserves credit for ushering them through. But look, we have to wait to see. Sanctions take a long, long time. And don't forget, Wolfman, in 2016, the Obama administration also ushered in very comprehensive, very strong, then the strongest sanctions ever enacted against the North at the time. So we'll have to see where this goes. What it does show, though, is the international community further galvanizing against the threat posed by North Korea, and that Russia and China continue to be on board, at least on paper, is a healthy thing. Now we have to just, implementation is the devil of the detail there, and you heard Tillerson talk about that.
It looks like, Malvina, you know this a lot better than I do, the new South Korean government is certainly much more open than the Trump administration is to launching direct talks with North Korea, trying to ease this crisis.
Well, I think we have to remember that the Moon administration in South Korea, he is ideologically part of the Sunshine Policy. He firmly believes that engagement is the only way to change the regime. Now, President Trump, I don't think is ideological. I think he is willing to negotiate. You know, he's a businessman and transactional. So those two are not that far apart as people think, but they're coming from very different places.
He tweeted, the President Trump, just completed a call with President Moon of South Korea. He's the newly elected South Korean leader. Very happy and impressed with 15-0 United Nations vote on North Korea sanctions. But there is a significant difference in strategy and tactics between the South Korean government and the U.S. government.
Yeah, I mean, as Belvina rightly says, I mean, President Moon Jae-in is of the Sunshine Policy, a little bit different view, a softer view towards the North than his predecessor. But I think, again, given the race that the North has been on here to develop these capabilities and the threats they continue to pose, in fact, there are increased threats now. I think you are starting to see, I think, a gelling, a coalescing of some international, including South Korean approach and pressure to put on the North. Don't forget also that one of the things that the administration is doing right, I think, is trying to work trilateral cooperation between Japan, South Korea, and the United States, which has historically been difficult given the history between South Korea and Japan, but that also is coming together.
The fact that Russia, but especially China, was on board in this unanimous United Nations Security Council resolution imposing new sanctions against North Korea, how significant is that?
Well, it is significant to the extent that finally I think the pressure is on
backed
China
it before.
actually
It's Russia
to do
that's
something
significant.
more. But before we go on congratulating China as this incredible achievement, you have to remember this is the minimum of what China should have been doing. And we should also remember numerous times that China would not support sanctions, and Russia, by the way. So we already have 15 UN resolution sanctions on North Korea going back to actually 1993, but really 2006. 15, and during that time, North Korea has tested 5 nuclear weapons. So China is doing the minimum at this point of what it should be doing.
Thanks very much for coming. Appreciate it very much, John Kirby. You have no choice. You have to come because you're a CNN contributor. Secretary of State Rex Tillerson and his Russian counterpart met in Manila for the first time since the U.S. slapped new sanctions on Russia. Tillerson zeroed in on the reason for the sanctions, Russian meddling in the U.S. presidential election. Our global affairs correspondent Elise Lavin is joining us right now. Elise, what else have we learned about Tillerson's meeting with the Russian Foreign Minister Sergei Lavrov?
Well, Wolf, it seemed to be a very tense meeting. Not only was Russian Foreign Minister Lavrov complaining about those sanctions, Secretary Tillerson also was, seeking a little bit more clarification of that Russian move to cut 755 U.S. diplomats from the U.S. embassy in Russia. And so this whole issue of meddling, the Russian meddling in the U.S. election continues to be the elephant in the room. Take a listen to Secretary Tillerson earlier today in Manila.
And Russian meddling in the elections was certainly a serious incident. We talked about it in the discussion we had with Minister Lavrov yesterday, and trying to help them understand just how serious this incident had been and how seriously it had damaged the relationship between the U.S., the American people, and the Russian people, that this had created serious mistrust between our two countries, and that we simply have to find some way to deal with that.
So a lot of mistrust, but also a lot of critical national security issues, among them Syria, which they talked about, Ukraine, and North Korea, which is why they're there in Manila in the first place. But Wolf, this issue of the meddling, the investigations here in Washington into possible collusion between Russia and the Trump campaign continue to dog that relationship and making moving forward very difficult for these two leaders.
Any indication that by September 1st,
moving forward?
all those American diplomats and embassy personnel are about to be kicked out of Russia, that the U.S. will further retaliate? Because, as you know, at the end of the Obama administration, the U.S. expelled, about 34 or 35 Russian diplomats, shut down 2 Russian compounds in Maryland and Long Island.
So this is a tit for tat. As you said, the Obama administration made those moves. Remember, President Putin had held off, and this is really a follow-on to that. Secretary Tillerson said that they're considering a response. I think the question is whether they can, let this stand and move forward. They both said that they want to eliminate those irritants, as they say, in the relationship. They consider this one of them. I think it remains to be seen what that U.S. response is going to be and whether that's going to continue to spiral.
Yeah, the pressure on the Trump administration will be enormous. It's one thing to expel 34, 35 American diplomats from Russia. It's another thing for the Russians then to tell 755 American diplomats and other embassy personnel, you're out. That's a big number. All right, Elise, thanks very much. Our global affairs correspondent, Elise Lavin, reporting. Up next, as Tillerson meets with his Russian counterpart overseas. The investigation into possible collusion between the Trump campaign and the Kremlin expands. We have new information. And Mike Pence, the vice president, is striking back at a report in the New York Times that he is eyeing the Oval Office in 2020. The Times saying the vice president isn't alone. Details on what's being described as shadow campaigns that several Republicans are now running.
Hi, so I just got off the phone with our Allstate agent, and I know that we have accident.
Great. What do you make of this development?
It's not surprising to see him push back so aggressively on the New York Times. That's a part of the narrative that we see coming out of the White House. But I think Pence has to be honest and acknowledge what many of us reporters talking to conservative voters know, and that's that there are people in the Republican Party who have problems with Donald Trump, who would like Mike Pence to take a more prominent role in this administration, in the party as a whole, and maybe in the White House.
But I mean, the article also mentioned Senator Sass, Senator Cotton,
David Dial, both of them, which is
also
ground.
But what's interesting, Pence started a PAC.
Right.
That's unheard of for a vice president. Clearly, the president will have his back. The president, everything must be voted on the president. Why would a vice president start a PAC?
Well, what they would say probably is that what Pence is trying to do is use these funds to go to these states to rally the base on behalf of the president, so that people who really are walking away from supporting him will stay on the Trump train. I think what happens, though, is when you send someone like Pence out to get people on the Trump train, you risk the chance that some people are going to be like, maybe it should be the Pence train.
Meantime, the president's trying to control his own message. He tweets. We know that's how he speaks directly to millions of people. This is what he talked about fake news last night. You heard Mike Pence slamming fake news, the president as well. But fake news refuses to report the success of the first 6 months. Supreme Court, surging economy and jobs, border military security, ISIS and MS-13, etc.
We had stories on all of this.
I know, and I would like to say every day I talk about the economy. Every day I talk about jobs. And interestingly, the president's job record at 1,074,000 or 1,024,000 jobs is just slightly below the last 6 months of last year when President Obama had slightly more jobs created than that. So that's the real numbers coming from the and then you hear Kelly McEnany, who used to be a contributor here, has a new job. She was posting on the president's Facebook page her version of news, or just kind of like the good news stuff that the president would like to see, the real news, she says. This is the president trying to control the message again.
Absolutely, and I think what he risks is having someone who I think was so effective at communicating the Trump agenda to people who already aren't on Team Trump. You take that voice away and you put them in a space where people who you need to get on board just aren't likely going to watch. I think another thing that's worth paying attention to, two demographics, white evangelicals and white working class voters without a college degree have dropped in their approval of Donald Trump a bit, and I think perhaps she on behalf of the Trump administration wants to get the message to them that Trump is doing great.
Is that a re-election issue? I mean, is that part of a re-election bid?
Isn't everything, though, that's positive about Trump right now?
Everything I hear from Trump supporters out there is that the real news of this administration is not getting out. It's not breaking through. We're too mired in Russia. There is a real split among Republicans out there, and a growing split among Republicans out there about sort of the news they want out there and what Republicans want to focus on. I think great frustration that with Republicans controlling everything in the Capitol, they can't get anything done. None of the big ticket items, anyway.
Well, I watched that report, and every single thing she reported, we reported on CNNpolitics.com, CNNmoney.com, CNN US, CNN International.
She didn't mention the Russia probe.
Right, exactly. So, and I think that's the concern, right? You want to get a certain part of the message, not the message that we have polls saying many people actually care about.
This is called propaganda.
It's certainly not fair and balanced news.
Right. Interesting.
Gene,
thank you very much.
Come back
See you soon.
We'll see you tomorrow.
Awesome.
All right, time for early start new money this morning. The benefits of charitable giving might change if lawmakers push through tax reform. That's according to new analysis from the Congressional Budget Office. Most people don't donate to charity just because of the tax breaks they get. They donate to charity because it's the right thing to do. But the Republican plan to double the standard deduction, lower overall income tax rates, and repeal the estate tax, it has charity experts concerned. They think donations could drop by how much? Between $5 billion and $13 billion a year. That's according to one study. Here's why. Increasing the standard deduction would mean fewer people could itemize and claim those breaks. And lowering tax rates would make the deduction less worthwhile for those who still take it. But those in favor of these tax proposals say this could lead to people actually giving more to charities. They say if a person has to pay less to the government, they're more likely to give more money to charity. More money means more do-gooding.
Although I don't know that that is what economists have shown.
You know, it's interesting because the two things that are sacred in tax reform, we're told, are the mortgage interest deduction and the charitable giving. This analysis would suggest that even if you keep that sacred, it still could hurt charitable giving.
All right. North Korea facing steep penalties for its nuclear program. We are live in Manila, where world leaders are speaking with a unified voice.
We've not had an extended period of time where they have not taken some type of provocative action.
In the Philippines, at the Forum of Southeast Asian Nations, he's ramping up the pressure on North Korea just days after the UN Security Council unanimously approved the toughest sanctions to date against the Kim Jong-un regime.
So the next steps, obviously, are to see that the Security Council resolution sanctions are enforced by everyone. We will be monitoring that carefully and certainly having conversations with any and all that we see who may not be fully embracing not just the spirit of those sanctions, but the operational execution of those sanctions.
All eyes now on China, North Korea's largest trading partner. The Chinese voted for the UN sanctions and will be key to implementing them. We want to go to Manila now and bring in CNN's Ivan Watson. Ivan, the North Koreans moving ahead with developing the missile technology and their nuclear weapons. These sanctions come, but they are already under a very heavy sanctions regime. How is this going to happen, and will this really pressure the North Koreans?
Well, what this latest round of sanctions does is it bans North Korea's exports of coal and iron and even seafood. And the U.S. government estimates that it generates about a third of its export revenues from those activities. So this could have an impact on the ability to earn hard currency for the North Korean regime. North Korea has made it clear it doesn't care. It's responded just in the last couple of hours via the North Korean State News Agency, calling the new sanctions a violent violation of North Korean sovereignty and saying that the international community must be delusional if it thinks that sanctions can convince North Korea to give up its commitment to develop nuclear weapons as what it sees as a vital weapon of self-defense. Now, this is despite the fact that China, as you mentioned, the Chinese foreign minister is here in Manila. He met face-to-face with North Korea's foreign minister, and he urged him to abide by United Nations Security Council resolutions and stop firing intercontinental ballistic missiles. That's also what Southeast Asian nations, 10 of them, said in a joint communique here, saying that the two ICBM tests that North Korea carried out last week were a threat to world peace and that they were gravely concerned about that. Big question is that message getting through?
Okay, look, here's the deal. The secret to understanding North Korea is the same as the secret to dealing with North Korea. The reason why North Korea does what it does, not to do an impromptu Richard Painter impersonation, it's just this simple. It's a satellite state. Which way? It's a satellite state of the Eurasian Union under Vladimir Putin. Okay? And the reason why I say it's both the key to understanding and the key to dealing with him is because basically his end game is an out that equates to a betrayal of his own people. So that should be something we could use against them if we had people we could talk to as generals. They actually wanted to be nationalists and protect their country. Because ultimately, little son, or little Jean, whatever the fuck his name is, little Jean, what? He's just gonna bail. He's gonna start a big fucking war and then bail. starting the big war as Putin orders and failing because Putin promised it. Whether or not Putin actually, is there for him at the end is the only thing that remains to be seen.
Will Rex Tillerson, the U.S. Secretary of State, will he potentially shake hands or meet with the North Korean foreign minister when they're all under one roof? They've had a series of meetings today as part of the Asia Regional Forum. There are more than 20 top diplomats who are underneath one roof for that. The State Department says there's no plan for the two diplomats to meet. It'd be interesting to hear from people who were in the room if there was any interaction whatsoever between the diplomats from these two rival states. Miguel?
The North Koreans have long wanted that direct contact, official contact with the U.S. Ivan Watson for us in Manila. Thank you.
All right, breaking news. The Australian military says it has located a U.S. Osprey aircraft that went down there on Saturday. An Australian Navy survey ship locating the submerged aircraft off Australia's east coast overnight. The Australian military says it will survey the crash site with a submersible before beginning diving operations. 3 U.S. Marines remain missing since that crash. 23 Marines were rescued. Right, not much of a retirement for Jay Cutler. The former Bears quarterback was supposed to begin his broadcasting career this season, but instead he'll be taking snaps for the Miami Dolphins. Coy Wire with the details from this morning's Bleacher Report. That's next.
Now, Virginia's girls softball team learned a tough lesson about social media. Think before you post.
Coy Wire has more in this morning's Bleacher Report. Hi, Coy.
Good morning, Christine and Miguel. The 12 to 14-year-old girls team was disqualified from the Junior League World Series Championship game after an inappropriate photo was discovered on Snapchat. 6 of the girls were in a picture giving the middle finger following a semifinal win on Friday. The team apologized Saturday, but tournament organizers had already made their decision. In the statement, officials said the photo violated the league's policies regarding unsportsmanlike conduct. The team's manager says he feels the punishment doesn't fit the crime.
And these girls, they're human. They just made a mistake. It's not who they are. It doesn't define who they are or who they are for the rest of their lives. It was just a one moment in time. They just made a mistake.
The team had gone undefeated, beating their opponents by a combined score of 29-1 before heading to the World Series, featuring teams from around the globe. Former Bears quarterback Jay Cutler is coming out of retirement to sign a one-year deal with a reported $10 million to play for the Dolphins. This, according to the Miami Herald. Cutler's leaving a TV gig as a game analyst to reunite with his former offensive coordinator Adam Gase, who's now the head coach in Miami, after the Dolphins starter Ryan Tannehill partially tore his ACL, according to reports. So, another possible window of opportunity for Colin Kaepernick appears to have opened and closed, as the team was reportedly interested in signing him, as well as Tim Tebow. 10-year-old Jesse Paulus still deals with brain swelling and bone loss because of the leukemia he has battled since he was 4. Well, the cancer is now in remission, and this weekend he beat the New York Jets into submission, taking a handoff from quarterback Josh McCown, scampering 50 yards, leaving the defenders in the dust. His mom, dad, and older brother were there to cheer him on and watch him score a touchdown and to see the team lift him up in celebration. Jets found out about him from the Marty Lyons Foundation, which was started by a former player of theirs 35 years ago that grants the wishes of children with terminal and life-threatening illnesses. The team's also going to give Jesse and his family 4 tickets to their home opener next month. Wow. That's your feel-good story for today, guys.
Coy, why are you going to make me cry on a Monday morning? That is so sweet.
You know, I got to tell you, Coy, and that first story about the girl, the softball team, I think every parent should be aware that, their kids are posting stuff and doing stuff on the
I don't get how they don't get it anymore.
But no, it's worth a conversation with your kids about, hey, look, your scholarship, your admission to college, your job offer, all of those things, could be on the line if you're putting something out there that you don't want to.
That's exactly right. My dad speaks to young high school student athletes and their parents all across the country, and he tells them social media, don't post anything that you wouldn't want your grandmother or your grandfather to see. And
the grandmother rule. That's exactly the rule. Don't embarrass your mother.
My grandma watches the show, so keep it clean.
Keep it
clean. All right, Coy Wire, thank you. Nice to see you. President Trump calls the Russia probe a total fabrication, but the second in command of the Justice Department says the investigation is expanding. It will not be limited, as the president hopes. That plus Mike.
Bob Mueller understands, and I understand the specific scope of the investigation, and so no, it's not a fishing expedition.
Special Counsel Robert Mueller can investigate any crime he uncovers in his Russia probe. That clarity from the Justice Department after the president himself said his finances should be off limits.
The vice president with a harsh rebuke to a New York Times report that he's laying the groundwork for a White House run. He slams the suggestion as disgraceful, offensive, and absurd.
It's quite clear in terms of there being no daylight among the international community as to the expectation that North Korea will take steps.
Global pressure growing on North Korea to curb its nuclear program after sanctions are slapped on it unanimously by the UN Security Council. Welcome back to Early Start. I'm Miguel Marquez, in for Dave Briggs today.
Nice to see you.
Good to be
here. I'm here all week. I'm Christine Romans. It is almost 32 minutes past the hour. Good morning, everyone. The second in command of the Justice Department rejecting any suggestion. Special Counsel Robert Mueller cannot dig into Trump family finances. Deputy Attorney General Rod Rosenstein says Mueller can look into any crimes he might discover within the scope of his probe. Rosenstein's remarks come days after President Trump said Mueller would cross a red line if he were to dig into his family's finances.
Now, CNN reported last week federal investigators are looking into potential financial ties between Russia and the president and his associates, viewing any such ties as fertile ground for their probe. Rosenstein, who authorized the special counsel, said he'd have to approve any expansion of Mueller's probe.
The special counsel is subject to the rules and regulations of the Department of Justice, and we don't engage in fishing expeditions. Now, that order that you read, that doesn't detail specifically who may be the subject of the investigation because we don't reveal that publicly. But Bob Mueller understands, and I understand the specific scope of the investigation, and so no, it's not a fishing expedition.
Also this morning, intrigue around the White House and who may occupy it come 2020. Vice President Mike Pence emphatically denying a New York Times report that he is laying the groundwork to run for president if President Trump doesn't seek a second term. All this with the president beginning what he calls a working vacation at his golf club in New Jersey. That's where we find CNN White House correspondent Athena Jones with the latest. Good morning, Christine and Miguel. Vice President Pence is pushing back hard on this New York Times story, as are other White House officials. The Vice President taking the unusual step of putting out an official statement on White House letterhead to respond to this story. In the statement, the Vice President called the story disgraceful, offensive, categorically false, laughable, and absurd. Two Pence aides, his spokesperson, and his chief of staff was mentioned in the New York Times story, also taking to Twitter to refute the story, calling it fake news. And White House counselor Kellyanne Conway, appearing on ABC this week, called the story complete fiction. Watch.
It is absolutely true that the vice president is getting ready for 2020 for re-election as vice president.
No concern.
He's also getting ready for 2018. Zero concern. That is complete fiction. That is complete fabrication. And I know that his advisors who had comments attributed to them have pushed back very strongly, as has the vice president, and as am I right now unequivocally. Vice President Pence is a very loyal, very dutiful, but also incredibly effective vice president, active vice president with this president.
And I think the operative phrase in what Kellyanne Conway said was very loyal. White House officials want to make it very, very clear that the vice president has no designs on the president's job in 2020. And I think it's important to note that President Trump has made it quite clear that he plans to run again, that he hopes to be a two-term president. In fact, he filed the paperwork to do so very early in his presidency and has held multiple campaign rallies. That is why we're seeing such strong pushback from the White House on this story. Christine, Miguel.
Thanks, Athena Jones. And to help to bring clarity to all this is CNN politics reporter Eugene Scott. Good morning to you.
Mr. Clarity.
Mr. Clarity. You better have your best clarity with you this morning. So there's this reports that the vice president has started this political action committee, that indicates perhaps a certain willingness, or at least positioning himself. Then SAS Senator Tom Cotton There's also Senator John Kasich also making similar moves to sort of reach out to figure out what's going on. In a statement about the New York Times article, the Vice President said this: "Today's article in the New York Times is disgraceful and offensive to me, my family, and our entire team. The allegations in this article are categorically false and represent just the latest attempt by the media to divide this administration. Whatever fake news may come our way, our entire team will continue to focus all our efforts to advance the president's agenda and see him reelected in 2020. Any suggestion otherwise is both laughable and absurd." Does he protest too much?
It seems like if the media isn't dividing this administration, the administration seems divided and the media is reporting on it. The reality is that those of us who are covering conservative voters regularly meet people out in all parts of America who are dissatisfied with the president, who look at Mike Pence a bit more favorably. I think it would be a bit less than honest to suggest that he's not aware of that message as well, and that there may be some people in his world who are looking into seeing whether or not he could be received more favorably than Trump is.
Whispers in Washington for some time have been that they expect Ohio Governor John Kasich to mount a bid against the president, primary running against the president, but that's a pretty crowded field when you look at all those names that they're talking about there. Meantime, you have the president tweeting about his 200 days. Last night he said this: "The fake news refuses to report the success of the first 6 months. Supreme Court, SC, surging economy and jobs, border, military, security, ISIS, and MS-13, etc." These are all things that I know you have reported on, that I have reported on. We talk a lot about the economy, of course, and how strong it has been. We talk a lot about job creation and the million jobs that have been created in the first 6 months of this year that just about matches the million plus created in the final 6 months of the Obama administration. The president also, he takes to Twitter to try to get his own message across, but there's not a new way that the White House is going to be getting news about. Tell us about that.
Yeah, well, we're seeing the White House release videos that they call real news. Now, the real news features positive Trump news that some have called propaganda on social media in response, because it doesn't feature the criticism that the president is receiving, the low poll numbers. It doesn't feature news regarding Russian investigation. And I think the desire is to keep people on the Trump train amid record low approval ratings of people who perhaps have an unfavorable view of the president.
His base, which is not necessarily all Republicans, are incredibly upset that the media isn't getting the story out there of all of the great things that he has done.
But
there is approval ratings right now.
There's no question that there's a pro-business climate that this president has unleashed, right? I mean, there's no question about that. The question to me for the
last year, Republicans and Russians pulled their money out of the stock market to give the Democrats a hard time. This year, they're putting their money back into the stock market to create an artificial bubble. Why? It's probably all going to crash again. Boring Mike Pence. Dull Mike Pence. Dull Mike. It's a dull Mike. Well, he's going to be president for at least a couple of weeks here shortly. Feeling out his re-election.
me ask you, first of all, just how the landscape has changed now that the president has signed this legislation, albeit somewhat begrudgingly, heightening sanctions, as I mentioned, and also restricting what he's able to do to change the contours of sanctions packages, particularly when it comes to Russia.
Well, the sanctions law is a very, very strong one. This is going to restrict essentially any transactions with Russia's defense and intelligence sectors, with some of its offshore Arctic and deep water energy sector. This will have a real long-term hit on the Russian economy. And so Russia has chosen to retaliate by reducing essentially the staff of the U.S. mission in Russia. It is not anywhere near as significant as what the sanctions bill will do to Russia. But what's interesting is the Trump administration has decided not to come out and condemn the Russian move. Instead, they sort of said they're going to take until September to decide what to do, which is fine. But what they have done that's a little bit odd is echo the Russian talking points on this to suggest that Congress is to blame for the deterioration in our relationship, and that really the administration just wants to get along and essentially move past it.
What's the goal, do you think, for Secretary of State Rex Tillerson with the meeting this week, and what's the relationship more generally? You look at the previous relationship that Sergei Lavrov had with Secretary of State John Kerry. They were visiting with and talking to each other most weeks. It seemed like they had what looked like a very close diplomatic relationship. How markedly different is this one, and is that a kind of relationship that Secretary of State Rex Tillerson would like to have with his Russian counterpart?
I think he would. I think he'd like to have a close, amicable relationship with Foreign Minister Lavrov, and of course that's in everybody's interest, that they speak frequently and that they're able to communicate well with each other. The problem here is not really with the amount or frequency of communication or the amicableness of their relationship. The problem has to do with Russia's actions. It has to do with what they're doing in Ukraine. We had 4 Ukrainian civilians killed over the weekend by either Russian proxies or Russian troops in Ukraine. We have Russia's intervention in Syria. We have their constant social media intervention here in the United States. So until their behavior changes, it's hard to see how the tenor of the relationship writ large changes, regardless of whether there is constant communication or not.
What changes with regard to the pressure that North Korea is under?
Sure. Thanks, David. Well, these latest sanctions are really targeting, they're substantial in the sense that they're targeting about $1 billion in North Korean exports, which is primarily to China. That's the largest trading partner North Korea has, their main source of foreign currency. So in that sense, they're significant. The catch comes that it takes a while, tends to take a while for sanctions to take effect. And China's previous efforts have had kind of a limited impact on North Korea's weapons program, as we saw last month when there were 2 ICBM tests.
You hear time and time again the goal here is to have a diplomatic solution to this crisis. There was a statement from the North Korean government out today, quote, "We will under no circumstances put the nukes and ballistic rockets on the negotiating table, neither shall we push even an inch from the road to bolstering up the nuclear forces chosen by ourselves unless the hostile policy and nuclear threat of the U.S. against the DPRK," that being North Korea, "are fundamentally eliminated." What do people say? How to game this out here? What's the likelihood that we have all of these parties back to the negotiating table? That's something that the president of South Korea would like to see happen, I'd imagine.
If you take North Korea's statement on its face, I think it's hard to see how we end up back at the negotiating table before they really get to the point technologically where they can deliver a nuclear warhead to the United States. Now, will the U.S. let them get to that point? The U.S. policy is no, but so far North Korea's progress in developing these missiles has been ahead of the pace expected by U.S. intelligence agencies. Now, Secretary of State Tillerson said on his trip in Southeast Asia that it would be helpful if North Korea reduced the pace, slowed down its nuclear tests. It's hard to see that happening, given that this is really North Korea's primary goal, to develop this missile system and then be able to force people to the table.
Of course, China playing such an outsized role here. China's saying on the sidelines of that ASEAN meeting in Manila, they don't want the situation to escalate further. It seems like it's on that track, however.
Right, and this is going to be a real interesting test of China's influence over North Korea. They put a temporary ban on coal exports, coal imports from North Korea earlier this year. That prompted North Korea to say that the Chinese were dancing to the tune of the United States. Now these are even more significant sanctions, but we'll have to see in the coming weeks and months whether they really end up pinching Pyongyang or whether the regime goes forward and keeps testing its systems.
You guys saw that article in the New York Times and released this rather extraordinary 4-paragraph statement calling this disgraceful, offensive, false, a latest attempt by the media to divide the administration. There are some who might see that and say, methinks the VP don't protest too much.
Well, he does find it very offensive. I mean, the vice president is entirely focused on advancing the president's agenda and doing everything possible to make sure that in 2020, the vice president is reelected as vice president alongside President Donald.
What is so offensive about it?
Any suggestion that he might be planning a run in 2020, his entire focus is on advancing the president's agenda and taking the steps that are necessary to make sure that we're delivering on the promises to the American people.
Okay, but respectfully,
It's offensive because it angers the dear leader.
that's not what the article says. The article points out some of the steps that the vice president has taken. So is it or is it not true that he did in fact set up a PAC and that it's essentially more than double the money raised by President Trump's PAC?
It is true.
That is true. Is it or is it not true?
But it also is. But what needs to be included is that Ivanka Trump introduced the vice president at a fundraising event just 2 or 3
I'm not saying that's not the case, but I'm saying
entirely focused.
But I'm saying it is true that he has a PAC that's raising more money by the president. Is it or is it not true that he went to Joni Ernst's pig roast in Iowa?
At the invitation
That
of the president.
Okay, but it's true, right?
He went and helped
Is it or is it not true that he's been meeting with donors at his residence?
He has been meeting with business leaders.
That is true. That is true that he's meeting with donors. Now, I'm not saying he's gearing up for a run, Mark, and I get that you're pushing back on that idea, but what is so offensive about putting actual correct facts in a piece and pointing them out and laying them out in an article?
Well, I think it's important to have context. It's important to know that Ivanka Trump introduced the vice president at the fundraiser. The first check that leadership PAC cut was to the president's re-election campaign, that he went to Iowa at the request of the president to show support for Senator Joni Ernst.
The article rightfully knows.
That's why.
Sure, it rightfully knows. He even privately has not even said that he's trying to distance himself from the president. Yet these steps are happening. Hypothetically, if the president were, for whatever reason, decide not to run in 2020, which is something that could happen, are you saying Vice President Pence would not step up and try to take that role?
Well, I don't talk about hypotheticals. All I know is that every day.
Well, you do talk about hypotheticals. You talk about hypotheticals all the time. So I'm just saying, are you ruling out that possibility?
What I'm talking about is that we are all operating under the assumption every day that the president is seeking re-election in 2020. That is our goal. That's our focus on delivering his agenda and making sure that we are in a position where the president can be re-elected and continue to lead this country for another 7.5 years.
So then 2 questions. Then why so early with these interactions with donors, with setting up a PAC? That has not typically happened less than 6 months into an administration.
Well, the vice president was governor prior to serving as vice president, so he had some political assets and operations that could not translate to the federal level without the creation of a federally regulated infrastructure. So that's what you saw in doing that. But the bottom line of that leadership PAC is that he's out there supporting Republican senators and House members who support the president's agenda. This provides him to be able to travel to go talk about the need to have good Republican leadership that are supportive of the president through the next couple of years, and that's very important. It's something that vice presidents have done throughout their tenure.
Well, so when this piece from the New York Times says that some of the vice president's advisors are intimating, perhaps, to high-level Republican donors in that class, that the vice president would be ready to step in if the president were to decide not to run, is that incorrect?
It is incorrect, and
so the vice president is not ready to step in if the president were to decide not to run.
Have pushed back to say that those conversations did not happen that way, and donors are never
Trumpers who might be quoted in there might have read conversations differently. The vice president's focus, the focus of his entire team, is entirely focused on advancing the president's agenda and seeking and putting him in a position to be reelected.
This statement slams fake news. It says it's false. It says it's offensive. It seems like your problem is more with some of the Republicans quoted in this piece than the piece itself. If you have an issue with Charlie Dent for interpreting some of this information the way he did, have you talked to Charlie Dent about it?
Well, what I'm talking about from the vice president's side is that from the vice president's side of that article, this is a conjecture, speculation, and half-truths, not the full context of the entire story.
Respectfully, again, though, clearly some of these things are true. These things are true, though. He is raising money. He is meeting with donors, and he is traveling to states that
What about it being
you don't
offensive
travel
and
to unless
dishonest?
you're setting the stage for a president.
But if you don't include the rest of the fact that he's doing that with the support of the Trump administration, Ivanka Trump introduced.
Oh, he's raised 540,000 and Trump only got 200,000. Oh wow.
Him, then you have half the story. You don't have the full picture.
There have been in the past discussions about vice presidents who have wanted to perhaps take more of a robust role in an administration. I think about cking, for example. There's never been a statement like this that's been released from the White House pushing back against an article like this. Is this aimed at an audience of one, somebody who is sitting in Bedminster right now who might be reading the New York Times and wondering why the vice president might be in fact creating the shadow?
I think the one thing that we know about both President Trump and Vice President Pence is that they're going to speak their minds directly to the American people and correct issues where they believe things are either taken out of context or in fact are fake news. What you're seeing is the vice president in this case pushing back strongly, emphatically, that he is not engaging in some sort of shadow operation.
So why didn't he just walk into the president's office and tell him that? Why release a statement to the media about it? Clearly this is aimed at President
When
Trump.
you have something that appears on the front page of the Sunday New York Times that's based on conjecture, speculation, that's suggesting something that is not true, it's important that the vice president speak his mind and clear the record on that, and which is another reason why I'm here today.
Hey there, I'm Chris Hayes from MSNBC. Thanks for watching.
Well, he was getting a little bit offensive. Are you fucking serious?
North Korea vowing a thousand-fold revenge against the U.S. in response to
You know, you're not supposed to quote the North Koreans and tell the American people exactly what they want you to tell them. Fox. All they're saying about Rosenstein is that he promises to crack down on leakers. Okay, what's this bullshit about? Hillary Clinton. What the fuck? Oh, fuck. Chaffetz. What a fucking Russian shill if I ever saw it.
And you know what? The Department of Justice can go back and prosecute those people within that State Department and other agencies who were not responsive in their FOIAs. That's also
I'd really like to stick my fucking foot through his teeth first.
not legal, so go prosecute that.
Yeah. Oh, in addition to this, we're seeing that essentially there are emails back and forth that involve Washington Post and New York Times reporters who seemed like they didn't really want to pursue the story, but were kind of backing is that they were under pressure from their bosses, so they were going to have to do it. We have part of one from the Washington Post, a reporter who reached out to the Department of Justice.
They just showed the fucking video. Oh my god.
And said, any chance that one of you could give me a call for another hopefully quick conversation about this AG Clinton meeting? My editors are still pretty interested in him. I'm hoping to put it to rest, essentially, and it goes on there. But essentially saying, I want to quiet the story down.
Yeah, you've already come to the conclusion that they're just going to quickly gloss over this. Let's also remember that during this whole investigation, initially started by a Inspector General report saying classified information, non-classified setting, they never impaneled the grand jury. And now the Department of Justice is coming out and saying, well, we just do this as a routine and, it's a good way to get documents and interview witnesses. How come they didn't do that in the other Department of Justice?
Because she didn't fucking do anything wrong,
it's
dumbass.
Such a double standard. I want them to hold people accountable regardless of party, but they haven't been doing that. And part of the public's way to do that is
Okay. Report to jail.
to get access to these
fucking
documents. There
traitor.
are documents, the American people's documents, through the FOIA.
This man has been running a Russian counterintelligence operation from the floor of Congress.
Well, and so many of them are redacted. ACLJ says they're going to go to court because there's so much they can't even tell from what they did get.
Congress requested this. They never gave them to Congress. They even issued subpoenas. They still didn't give them under subpoena. That is against the law. When you have a duly issued subpoena, you have to respond to it. It's not optional. That is another place where the Department of Justice can go after
Misquoting the law.
current federal employees.
All right, we're going to have to get you when you're not so sedate this morning.
Yes.
Good to have you with us. Good to see you.
Very few congressional subpoenas actually have any legal teeth.
Yeah. Leland?
Fox News alerts a small group of Venezuelan men have launched an attack on a military.
Wait, hold up. 400 emails about the meeting, and all you got is some quotes from the fucking Washington Post? Hold up.
A matter, whatever you want to call it. The American Center for Law and Justice had FOIA, made Freedom of Information requests they've gotten hundreds of documents now. Now, what they point out is when they first made this request, months ago, they were told under the last administration, I want to get this wording right, because if you've ever filed a FOIA request, you know this is what they say. They say, essentially, we have no records responsive to your request. And now they have hundreds of pages responsive to their request.
Yeah, initially that had to be a lie. You're required under law to respond to this Freedom of Information Act request within 20 days. To say there were no documents is an absolute fabrication. And you know what? The Department of Justice can go back and prosecute those people within that State Department and other agencies who were not responsive in their FOIAs. That's also not legal, so go prosecute that.
Yeah. Oh, in addition to this, we're seeing that essentially there are emails back and forth that involve Washington Post and New York Times reporters who seemed like they didn't really want to pursue the story, but were kind of backing is that they were under pressure from their bosses, so they were going to have to do it. We have part of one from the Washington Post, a reporter who reached out to the Department of Justice and said, any chance that one of you could give me a call for another hopefully quick conversation about this AG Clinton meeting? My editors are still pretty interested in him. I'm hoping to put it to rest, essentially, and it goes on there. But essentially saying, I want to quiet the story down.
Yeah, you've already come to the conclusion that they're just going to quickly gloss over this. Let's also remember that during this whole investigation, initially started by a Inspector General report saying classified information, non-classified setting, they never impaneled the grand jury. And now the Department of Justice is coming out and saying, well, we just do this as a routine and, it's a good way to get documents and interview witnesses. How come they didn't do that in the other Department of Justice? And so, it's such a double standard.
Anything that the CIA might be up to, Chaffetz has been calling a criminal act. Anything the CIA, anything our secret agents in general have been doing behind the scenes to protect the country, Chaffetz not only wants the American people to know a Russian twisted side of the story, but he wants us all to get really angry about it, too. Well, it doesn't look like there's much else going on right now.
Well, looks like Marlena's putting on a show for you. Yeah, the Donald Trump video started playing by itself. And yeah, pretty much. Man, those Euphelias are doing that.
Fish cake. Ooh.
I think I may have had the lights up too late.
So, Maxima, you still there? Were you watching?
I was paying too much attention to the news, apparently. I don't see it in babies.
$1,000,001 ways to kill a clown. Well, this really sucks. Last time I looked in here, they were just fine, and now I don't see any of them.
I don't know what I did wrong. I didn't get to see him dive bomb or spin around or nothing. But because I'm relatively low on food cultures, I was trying to leave the water as green as possible. Oh God. Mm-hmm. All right, I don't know what to do. Did you happen to see any of the babies spinning around at the surface? Because I can't see any of them, so they might all be dead. Hi, man. Like between the power outs and everything else. Fucking annoying.
That's Blake McCoy reporting from Bloomington, Minnesota for us. For a closer look now, I want to bring in Dino Vidala. He's the host of Sirius XM, the Dino Vidala Show, the only daily national radio show hosted by a Muslim American. He's also a columnist for the Daily Beast, who reminded me we have 2 Muslim members of Congress in the United States, right? Yes. Andre Carson of Indiana being the other one. So here's the good part. After this happens in this mosque, everybody comes together in this community. There were faith leaders who came and stood with the imam, and you saw the gathering of people outside. But the bottom line is, a couple of hours before this bomb was thrown in, there were 300 people in that mosque. Or it was a couple of hours afterwards, there would have been. So in other words, this could have been a very different story that we're talking about.
Certainly, and we can't look at this in a vacuum. That's the biggest thing. That's why I wrote the article at the Daily Beast. My Facebook page is filled daily with Muslims around the country, young Muslims, talking about being harassed, being bullied, attacks on the mosque, death threats. You live in a country now where you're a parent and you're a parent of Muslims, you fear your kids going out because they might be attacked at a mosque. This is a place of worship. There should be zero tolerance policy about any of this. So it's so great to see Jewish, Muslim, Christian leaders shoulder to shoulder standing united for the values of America.
No message from the president yet. Now, we don't know what this is. We don't know if it's a hate crime. We don't know what it is yet. The governor has called it an act of terrorism. Does it surprise you, and does it matter that the president hasn't chimed in?
Of course, it doesn't surprise me, even if it's turned out to be a true terrorism, and I think it is, but we'll see how the evidence turns out. I don't expect Donald Trump to stand up for the American Muslim community. You know, this is a man who campaigned in ways we never saw, demonizing our community, saying Islam hates us, saying thousands of Muslims cheered on 9/11 in New Jersey, which was such a lie. Rudy Giuliani said it was not true, calling for a complete shutdown on Muslims. He demonized our community, where what we're seeing today, the climate we live in, is thanks to a man named Donald J. Trump, who was president of the United States. So I don't expect him to stand up for us. Our community feels very alone. And not only alone, we feel like we have a president who demonizes to win votes, doesn't care about us, and it's a time of fear that's palpable, and it should not be something in 2017 you should worry about, because if your faith, you or your family might be attacked or killed.
But ultimately, I spoke to the executive director of this mosque earlier today, and he was saying that the relations that they enjoy with the community are generally strong. You know, Muslims have been in America for a long time. There's in some of these areas, they're slightly newer communities. Some of them are first generation, and he feels that the community's not hostile toward them.
And that's a great thing. And you saw that. I saw immediately that within hours of the attack, the leaders of different faith communities standing up and saying, "We're with you." This mosque, according to local media reports, they did get some emails and hate mail before. Just a week ago, another Muslim cemetery in the Minneapolis suburbs was vandalized with swastikas, graffiti. Since January, we've had 5 mosques burned down in America by arson. That's according to the police. We've had swastikas written on mosques. We've had the word Trump painted on mosques in New Jersey.
The investigation into Russia's meddling in the U.S. presidential election appears to be entering a new phase. The source tells CNN the special counsel Robert Mueller has issued grand jury subpoenas for documents and testimony related to Donald Trump Jr.'s meeting with a Russian lawyer last summer. The Deputy Attorney General was asked how far Mueller's investigation can go.
If he finds evidence of a crime that's within the scope of what Director Mueller and I have agreed is the appropriate scope of this investigation, then he can. If it's something outside that scope, he needs to come to the acting Attorney General, at this time me, for permission to expand his investigation.
Let's bring in our CNN crime and justice reporter, Shimon Prokopez. Shimon, update us on what we know right now about the various threads of Robert Mueller's investigation.
Well, that's right. Well, there are several various threads, right? We have the potential obstruction of justice thread, and then we have the overall big investigation, which now appears to be financial in nature, in that Mueller and his team of 16 lawyers and close to 3 dozen staffers and investigators have been poring over all these various financial records related to the Trump organization. We're also told some of the records that are being scrutinized have to deal with his son, Don Jr., and also other property records such as Trump Tower in New York. They're looking at who has spent time there, who has rented offices there, has lived there. All of this part of their larger investigation investigation into the relationship between Russia and folks close to Donald Trump. And really the key here now is that they want to go back, and investigators want to go back and see when were these relationships established, and if that sort of has had any effect on some of the decision making.
Yeah, and Rod Rosenstein, the Deputy Attorney General, offering a very strong source of support for Robert Mueller, the special counsel, in that interview yesterday. Shimon, thanks very much, Shimon, for the reporting. Let's get some further perspective on the Russia investigation. Democratic Congressman Eric Swalwell of California is joining us. He's a member of both the House Intelligence and Judiciary Committees, joining us from Oakland, California. Thanks, Congressman, for joining us.
Of course, Wolf. Thanks for having me back.
So what's your reaction to the Deputy Attorney General Rod Rosenstein's comment that the special counsel Robert Mueller can investigate basically any crime he seems to uncover in the course of his work?
Well, it makes sense, Wolf, because we know that the ties that Donald Trump, his family, his campaign have to Russia are very, very financial in nature. We know that Donald Trump has invested in the Russians over the years and that they have invested in him. He sought trademarks that he was granted over in Russia. He had the Miss Universe contest over in Russia. He sought to peddle Trump vodka over in Russia, and Russians have bought condos in his buildings in New York, and it was a Russian oligarch who purchased a West Palm Beach home that Donald Trump had bought in 2004 and later sold in 2008 to that individual, reaping a profit of 129%. It's certainly worth exploring further.
CNN has learned, Congressman, that Robert Mueller has expanded his investigation to include that actual money trail. He's following the money, as they say. So specifically, you mentioned a couple of examples. What does that suggest to you? What if he follows the money and comes up with something that has absolutely no connection to the allegation of Russian Trump campaign collusion?
Well, the premise of the collusion, or at least the premise of the ties that many have alleged occur between Donald Trump and Russia has been that Russia sought to influence members of Donald Trump's campaign and perhaps the president himself. And one of the ways that Russia has done this with other individuals in the United States, as James Comey testified on March 20, is by entangling them in financial relationships or preying on financial distress. Now, there's also in law, Wolf, there is a concept called plain view. So if the police go to a building and they're looking for a gambling ring and they happen to walk upon a meth lab, they don't have to look the other way. They can actually explore that as long as they are lawfully in the building. So if they are lawfully looking for coordination with Russians and they come across other crimes that may have been committed, they don't have to look the other way.
You've heard the president, he calls this whole Russia probe a witch hunt hoax. And he goes specifically one step further, saying that probing his finances or those of his family members and associates, that simply goes way too far across that red line. Your reaction?
Well, good thing he doesn't get to set the red lines here. Well, Congress also has a role to play, and the Senate, in a bipartisan way last week, showed that they intend to put guardrails in place if he tries to get rid of Bob Mueller. So I'm satisfied that leaders in Congress will assert our co-equal jurisdiction to make sure that this investigation is able to fairly run its course.
If you have great confidence in Robert Mueller, and I assume you do, why do you still want an independent commission, a separate new commission to be set up to investigate Russian meddling in the U.S. election?
Bob Mueller's role is to understand whether any crimes were committed. Our role in Congress, and I believe the September 11 Commission, what they did so well was that they were able to look outside of the crimes, but at how we can make sure this never happens again. So after September 11th, a bipartisan appointed independent panel of commissioners who had foreign policy and national security expertise looked at our vulnerabilities and then made recommendations for Congress to put in place how we can make sure that a vulnerability like that never happened again. Here in Congress, I see that this has become too politicized, and also we just don't have the time to devote ourselves to understanding just exactly what Russia did. And, it's certainly important, but there's other duties in Congress, and so I think the best thing we can do to depoliticize it, to debunk a lot of the myths the president has put out there, and declassify as much of the facts as possible for the public, is to have a full-time commission look at what Russia did, and then have us go to work to make sure the ballot box is more secure next time.
In recent days, there's been a bipartisan push among some senators to actually bar the president from directly firing the the special counsel, Robert Mueller. The White House counselor, Kellyanne Conway, says that's not even on the president's radar. Listen to this.
Does the president commit to not firing Robert Mueller? The president has not even discussed that. The president is not discussing firing Bob Mueller.
All right, so what's your reaction to Conway's statement?
Well, the president has a past history of trying to intimidate individuals by kind of floating out ideas. We saw this with the suggestion that President Obama had wiretapped Trump Tower. He said that James Comey better hope there aren't tapes, which I believe was a way to try and intimidate the former FBI director from coming forward and testifying. And I think by trying to undermine Bob Mueller's investigation, he is trying to make Bob Mueller worried that he may be fired, or try and do everything he can to undermine and, I guess, cast doubt upon anything that Bob Mueller finds. I think the American people are behind Bob Mueller, and they will probably accept whatever he finds or doesn't find.
So where do you see this heading in the short term? Are we close to getting some answers?
On our House investigation, we made more progress in the last 3 weeks with the witnesses we brought in than we had made in the prior 5 months. So we're steadily going forward. We're interviewing witnesses, reviewing documents. We hope to report back to the American people soon. And we just want to make sure that Bob Mueller has all the resources and all the runway necessary to also, report back to the American people and clear the president if these were all just coincidences, but to hold people accountable if it was something more.
What's the definition of soon?
Well, I hope before the midterm elections will for the House investigation, because we want to make sure when people go to the ballot box in November that we have put some reforms in place so that not only Russia is deterred from doing this again, but other countries with similar capabilities.
Those midterm elections are still a long way off. All right, Congressman Eric Swalwell, thanks so much for joining us.
My pleasure, Will.
Coming up, Pence for 2020, the Vice President says that idea is absurd, it's offensive. We have details on that new report that he, along with other prominent Republicans, are already positioning themselves for a presidential run.
Don't miss the Super Tuesday sale at Geostrategy Bank. Up to 70% off almost everything in the store. All traveler sport coats $149, executive suits $179, and all dress shirts, including best-selling Traveler, just $39. Plus, take an extra 50% off clearance items only at Geostrategy Bank. This was easy as saving $600 when you switch to Progressive. Starring
Alright, so basically what I'm trying to do now, if I can't see any of the babies, is I'm trying to get water cleared back up again. It only looked to me like there were about maybe 5 or 6 of them actually swimming around in there. And I know one of them looked like it was having problems right off the bat. But I really was hoping for better luck this time. Oh, man, oh, man.
Appears
that hatch time is over for the day at least. Oh, man. So,
this really kind of sucks.
So if you yeah, it's like real life. Usually all the babies die. But if you happen to see one swimming around in there, let me know. At this point, the water is too cloudy for me to see the eggs that are still on the pod. So I've moved the cardboard
back on top of the pot. And all I can do now is
Just hope some more babies hatch out.
Trina, take a shower, get your hair brushed out really well.
Scholar Richard Reeves believes the United States is in need of some self-reflection about income inequality.
I think America doesn't want to have a conversation about class, is uncomfortable with it.
Reeves is a co-director of the Brookings Institution Center on Children and Families. His new book, Dream Hoarders, argues that while the top 1% of America's wealthy receive so much attention, the more significant divide is between the top 20% and everyone else struggling to achieve the American dream. Reeves suggests the advantages of those at the top are gained simply by being part of the right socioeconomic group. By supporting certain policies and behaviors, they protect their status and keep others out.
The dream hoarder is someone that's a member of the American upper middle class, so that's on the top rung in terms of income ladder, but is then using that position to rig certain systems or certain markets so that they succeed and their kids succeed. So rig the housing market, rig the education market, some extent rig the labor market. And so it's basically like a cartel in business, if you like, where you're using your power in an anti-competitive way rather than in a competitive way. We all want to think of ourselves as middle class, but we're not. 9 in 10 Americans define themselves as middle class in one form or another. And it's obviously an attractive thing to say we're all the same class, we're all in the same boat. You're stretching the definition of middle now to include people with very healthy six-figure incomes right at the top of the distribution. And at some point, the word middle ceases to mean very much.
Reeves defines the upper middle class as families making $117,000 or more a year. To illustrate the difference between them and everyone else, Reeves points to this statistic. Between 1979 and 2013, the total pre-tax income for the bottom 80% of Americans grew by $3 trillion. The much smaller group that makes up the top 20%, their income grew by $4 trillion, $1 trillion more. Reeves says the upper middle class income gains mean a greater benefit from the government's home mortgage interest tax deduction and more power to insulate themselves in better schools and neighborhoods.
If you're in the upper middle class, you get to buy an expensive house, more expensive than most of them can afford. You then get a deduction from the Treasury for doing that, so you're helped by the government to buy this expensive house. You can then use local zoning ordinances or land use regulations to ensure that only people like you can live in your neighborhood. And then you can organize your school admissions policy based on neighborhoods, which means that even public schools can actually be predominantly affluent and high quality because of the way we've organized it.
Reeves calculates almost 40% of the upper middle class live near public schools with the best test scores, according to the data from the U.S. Census Bureau and the nonprofit Great Schools.
It's like an X-ray. It exposes the class fracture when schools get involved and when you think about kind of integration.
Take this elementary school in New York City's affluent Brooklyn Heights neighborhood. PS8 is predominantly white with test scores considerably above average. When the city's education department rezoned the area 2 years ago to ease overcrowding in PS8 and assign children to nearby PS307, some PS8 parents rebelled. PS307 had served predominantly low-income minority students with lower test scores.
It's not that anyone sat down and said, look, with some devilish scheme, let's find a way to rig the system and design tax and education and housing in this way. But it is the result of the interaction of those different kinds of systems, which many of us benefit from, and candidly we'll support those sorts of exclusionary mechanisms because it's in our short-term immediate self-interest to do that.
In the end, the Brooklyn Heights school rezoning went through, but Reeves says the class gap in education continues right on through college.
And you also talk a little bit about the idea of legacies and giving you a leg up if you're
parents went to the same college. How does that play out? Because most of the Ivy League schools said, no, we don't really do that. Not to a great extent. There's something deeply troubling about the idea that my kid should get preferential treatment getting into a particular college because I happen to go there or my wife did, whereas the kid of an immigrant by definition can't benefit from that, or a kid who was born poor, first in their generation to go to college. So there's something symbolically deeply unfair about that system. Besides that idea, a slightly more public example might be internships. Who gets them? How diverse that actually is. One survey suggested that 3 in 5 graduating college seniors have done some sort of internship. Many employers will give a job to someone who's done an internship. They'll certainly value someone who's done it. So it's become quite an important transition institution in the last 20 years. And what you find is that, first of all, many of them are unpaid, which means almost by definition that they're biased in favor of those from affluent backgrounds. But also, and even more egregiously in some ways, they're very often handed out on the basis of who you know or as a favor. Well, that's just cheating in terms of an open labour market and the kind of social norm we need to shift. Some critics of Reeves' work argue that laying the blame for lack of upward mobility on the upper middle class is misguided. In a recent Washington Post op-ed, economist Robert Samuelson wrote, though economic opportunities abound, the capacity to take advantage of them does not. That, not hoarding, is our real problem. As for parents, why make them feel guilty for wanting to help their children? What are parents for, after all? Let's not blame the struggle of the lower middle class and poor on the success of the upper middle class. The two are only loosely connected, if at all. But Reeves says being a successful parent shouldn't mean rigging the playing field.
The question then is, where's the line? When does sort of good parenting become some form of hoarding or kind of cheating? Because we're also in favour of a fair society. How do we manage schools? How do we vote on a local zoning bill? Do we play a legacy card and a donation card? How do we operate in our own institutions? It's not quite good enough just to say, well, everyone's doing it. Because that's the moral reasoning of a 6th grader. If my kid comes home and says, I cheated in math today, but everyone was cheating, do I say, oh, that's okay. As long as everyone's cheating, it's fine. At some point, we have to do better than that, I think.
One of the controversial things you point out is that for someone to move up, another person might have to move down. And that runs counter to everything we've ever grown up with. Well, there's plenty of room at the top. We can all get there. It is a zero-sum game. The top 20% can only ever contain a fifth of the population. That's just a math statement. And so, to that extent, you want more people moving into that top 20%. You do need some more people coming out of it, falling down. But downward mobility, while mathematically necessary, is also deeply unpopular, both at a personal and a political level. I think that's true for all of us. Very few of us are willing to decide which of our kids are going to be nominated to go down in order to create more room for poor kids to rise up. But it is a necessary part of the story.
Maryland missed.
I'm Keith Olbermann, and this is The Resistance.
Keith!
I did not write what follows, but it is perfect. So I will read it as it was written, and then I will give you the backstory afterwards. We cannot have a country led by a president subject to ongoing criminal investigations.
Okay. So, I am going to go ahead and relax because I failed again. It's been like almost a year since I successfully hatched a batch of clownfish. Kind of bad timing with the rotifers and just absent-mindedness. I think I had the TV too loud, So I'm going to play the video back and see if I can correlate increase in the level of the TV with the fish looking stressed out, or at least disappearing from view. If not, the only thing I can think of is I got the water too green, and being as I'm using RG Complete for green water, it doesn't keep very well. So you leave the water too green for too long and it gets really toxic really quick. Especially too toxic for true Percula babies. So I may or may not stream later tonight. If I get some babies, I probably will stream since I'm all set up and everything anyways. So thanks for watching, everybody, and go watch Keith Olbermann. He just uploaded. Take it easy. Peace.